Political parties can lie in their ads, and that's because it's legal to lie in political advertising. That's why every election we're flooded with scare campaigns and other rubbish designed to deceive us. Before the 2016 federal election, the Labor Party ran a scare campaign about how the coalition wanted to privatise Medicare. But that was a lie.
Privatising Medicare will be the end of Medicare as we know it. But who will stop the privatisation of Medicare services?
Labor will.
And in 2019, the coalition had their own scare campaign, lying about how Labor wanted to introduce a death tax.
Carbon tax.
Death tax.
Labor. It's the bill Australia can't afford.
Authorised by Ahurst, Liberal Party of Australia, Canberra.
And the coalition won that election.
I have always believed in miracles.
Now it's no surprise that both major parties haven't done much to limit lies during elections. And that's because scare campaigns are really effective. This is despite widespread public support to change the rules. Consistent polling has shown overwhelming support for truth in political advertising laws. The Australia Institute has done some great research on this. In 2019, their polling showed support of 84%, and that's across people of all political backgrounds. In 2023, support had increased to 87%. It's hard to find any issue that has that much support, and yet there's little action. While the major parties might not be doing much, there is someone who's trying.
We are at risk of a democratic crisis, in which election campaigns are increasingly battlegrounds of competing disinformation campaigns, which will continue to erode the public trust in institutions, in trust in government, and the trust in our democratic process itself. That's why I'm introducing the Stop the Lies Bill, which amends the Commonwealth Electoral Act to make it an offence to publish misleading or deceptive content in political advertising relating to an election.
That's Zali Steggall, the independent MP who took Tony Abbott's seat in Parliament. In 2021, she introduced the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Stop the Lies Bill. The bill went nowhere, so she tried again in 2022, updating her proposed legislation. And then most recently introduced a third version in 2023. But before we get into the details of those bills and what happened to them, I want to take a step back. There's a committee of Parliament called the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. This is a cross-party group of politicians that conduct inquiries and publish reports, and usually after each election, they'll review any issues that arose. The 2022 federal election was no different. In June 2023, the committee released their interim report on the conduct of the 2022 federal election. One of the areas the report looked at was truth in political advertising laws. Interestingly, it identified that other jurisdictions already have these laws in place. Take South Australia. Since 1985, their electoral legislation has contained provisions allowing the South Australian Electoral Commission to act against inaccurate and misleading political advertising. And there's fairly broad support for the South Australian model.
I think it would be a good idea. They exist in South Australia, they've been introduced in the ACT, we haven't actually seen them in action yet in the ACT. But it's not going to rule out all forms of untruth, but I think it does send a strong signal, and it does put up some guardrails around, the extent to which people can lie. And I think it could limit some of the more extreme forms of lying. One that I've theorised with a colleague called, particularly strategic lying, which, lying has become, a very disturbing and advanced spin technique, and it could help bring that back a little bit. So I would be very strongly in favour of us introducing that federally.
And while other experts have argued that the South Australian model is quite limited, it still seems to have had success. In 2014, the Liberal Party ran ads that lied about the then Labor Premier of South Australia. This was found to be a breach of the law, and the Liberals withdrew the ad. Also in 2014, the Labor Party made claims about one of their policies that was found to be false, and they too were asked to correct it. and there's been plenty more examples over the years. Other jurisdictions have started to follow the South Australian model, with the ACT most recently introducing similar legislation in 2020. Taking all this into consideration, the report recommended that the federal government put in place truth in political advertising laws similar to what they have in South Australia. Now is a good time to mention the Coalition's position on all of this. The committee report said that both the Liberal Party and the Nationals argued against the introduction of truth in political advertising laws, which of course they did. The Coalition wrote a dissenting report saying that they opposed restrictions to lying in political advertising because of the freedom of speech. It's an interesting argument because for you and I, there is no right to freedom of speech in Australia, nor is it something the Coalition actually believes in. You only have to look at the time when a Liberal senator threatened to sue and take down a website which was just publicly displaying how politicians voted in Parliament. Or Scott Morrison's proposed anti-troll legislation, which had nothing to do with trolling, but would have made it easier for politicians to sue their critics for defamation. Anyway, the Coalition's solution to political lies was to do nothing. They said it was the role of the media, civil society, and other political actors to hold untrue statements to account. And then in the very next paragraph, they threw in the example of the 2016 Medicare scare campaign to try and make the point that Labor was being hypocritical in wanting truth in political advertising laws because they themselves had engaged in scare campaigns in the past. I'm not sure how that's a good point, but to me, it only proves that the system we have now isn't effective at stopping these kinds of campaigns. So let's get back to what developments have happened at a federal level. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, Zali Steggall introduced her first Truth in Political Advertising bill in 2021. Nothing ended up happening, and she updated it in 2022.
Today, I call upon the House to end the free-for-all in political advertising. This bill, which will prohibit misleading or deceptive political advertising, is a practical, popular and proven way to clean up our politics. It approaches the regulation of political advertising with caution and respect for our constitutional freedom of political communication. This bill is also urgent. We live in a world where our democracy is under attack from misinformation. A vote based on lies and misleading information lacks social licence and divides our communities. It lacks legitimacy and erodes trust in election results.
But again, both major parties refused to allow the bill to be debated, and nothing happened until August 2023, when the bill was removed from the Parliament's list due to inaction. Then in November 2023, Zali Steggall introduced another bill for her third attempt at prompting debate in Parliament.
Today, I again call on the House to protect voters from misleading and deceptive political advertising. Voters want a debate based on policy and facts, not lies and fear-mongering. We have well-established laws to protect consumers from misleading advertising. We recognise the importance of protecting consumers from scams and unfounded claims. Yet we do not have the same protections for voters. The Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Voter Protections in Political Advertising Bill 2023 will prohibit misleading and deceptive political advertising.
This bill is ready to be brought forward for debate at any time if Labor allows it. But so far there's been no indication that that will happen. But given it's a possibility, I wanted to look at what the bill actually says. The explanatory memorandum goes through the detail. The bill prohibits political ads that contain statements of facts that are misleading or deceptive. For example, if an ad falsely claims that a candidate said something they didn't actually say. The bill also prohibits people from impersonating or falsely attributing material to a candidate or party. An example here would be a fake statement which is made to look like it comes from one party, when in fact it was published by another. Or telephone calls in an electorate with a voice recording impersonating a candidate. The bill then gives powers to the Australian Electoral Commission, which is the entity that currently runs our federal elections. These powers are to investigate possible breaches, order retractions, publish corrections, and even issue fines. With all this though, it's important to note that these powers are pretty limited in who they would apply to. It only applies to authorised election or referendum messaging, which are basically official political ads that you would see authorisation labels on. Like this. Or this.
Authorised by G-Right ALP Canberra.
Other communications, even if they are misinformation, are excluded from this bill. So this isn't about an ordinary person saying something untrue, but rather aimed at official election materials and statements. The bill also doesn't apply to expressions of political opinion, only statements of fact that are untrue. These limitations are important, because Australians have an implied freedom of political communication under our Constitution. But the courts have established that regulation can still be in place as long as the balance is right. And South Australia's laws have been tested in court for their constitutional validity and proved to be okay. So the bill seems to be quite reasonable. It's not overly broad or risky, unlike Labor's misinformation bill, which I did a separate video on. But that doesn't mean it's without its challenges. While the explanatory memorandum says that there will be no financial impact, in reality, implementing something like this will be very complex and costly.
The model that's previously been spoken about with this committee, or has been raised with the committee, is the South Australian legislation. I'd point out that the scale of a state election is tiny compared to what we do federally, and the sheer volume of issues that arise federally at election time would require quite a large support team to look at. There would also be an expectation from all of the candidates and parties that we are very swift with our responses, because it'll be something like, we need this ruling right now. The last election there were over 1,600 candidates, large number of parties, multiple contests. It's complex and difficult. I haven't put an exact figure on how many people, but it would need to be, particularly at election time, would need to be a significant team providing a very swift response, and it'll be complex, big and not cheap.
Then there's the fact that the Australian Electoral Commission doesn't even want these powers, which is quite rare for a regulator to come out and say.
The second part of your question, Chair, is about what do you think about the AEC's role in mis and disinformation. We're pretty comfortable that our role is to defend the electoral system, to defend and make citizens aware about the process of voting. But in terms of truth in advertising, any involvement of any electoral administration body, I think, runs counter to the principles of neutrality and non-partisanship, because the moment the Commissioner makes a ruling about a fact that someone said, you're alienating a large proportion of the population, because election time in particular, it's a contest of ideas. One person's fact is another person's falsehood, and I think there is a role for some form of truth in advertising, and I wish every success to whoever is doing that. But I prefer not the AEC to be the organisation involved in that process.
This difficulty in looking neutral, while also making determinations against one party or another, was something that the South Australian Commission raised as well.
And that's one of the challenges I find with this. We enjoy a reputation in South Australia of the electorate has full confidence in what we do. We've built up that reputation over a long period of time, and that's really important that the public, members of Parliament, candidates understand our role and our independence. It is a reality of administering misleading advertising provisions that we are drawn into the political debate. As often happens, if I was to make a decision that a publisher has misled, I will of course write to the complainant advising that I've made that decision and some context around what I've basically found and the request to the publisher of the material. Quite often, as it happens, within half an hour at least of me sending that letter, the complainant is in front of the media holding up my letter to say, look at my opponent, he's a liar, she's a liar, how can you trust that person? We are drawn into that, and that places me and the Commission in a difficult situation.
But just like South Australia, these challenges can be dealt with federally. Funding can start small and ramp up when the Australian Electoral Commission figures out how to best manage this. Even having the powers in place would act as a deterrent in a lot of cases. But like I said before, Zali Steggall's third bill still hasn't been debated. And that's surprising, given that Labor members were on the committee whose report we looked at earlier, and who recommended that truth in political advertising laws be introduced. In November 2023, the government did release a formal response to the committee report, and all they said was that they noted the recommendations and looked forward to engaging with colleagues across the Parliament on these vital reforms. Well, to date, not much engaging seems to have happened, and it's yet to be seen if anything comes out before the next election.